Dear Sergeyevich, esteemed leaders, representatives of embassies, ambassadors, first of all, I would like to note with pleasure that there are representatives from 100 embassies present in the hall. These are mainly ambassadors representing their countries in the Russian Federation in Moscow. We are very pleased to see such great interest in our conference today. I wanted to report, Sergeyevich, that we have been working for over an hour before this, and we had some very interesting presentations, reports, and a historical overview. Moreover, the historical overview touched on issues of culture, economics, and ethno-confessional relations in the new territories, as we now call them. And overall, it addressed both historical Novorossiya and Crimea. It seems to me that our guests today listened to the speakers with great interest. The opportunity to exchange brief opinions provided them with additional insight into how the historical situation developed. And in a way, this has led us up to your speech. Since we have mostly been talking about history, now I hope we will be able to discuss the current state of affairs. But today, all the key international players are talking about peace in Ukraine. Friendly countries have also put forward their own initiatives, China, India, Brazil, and of course our opponents as well. In your opinion, what is the fundamental difference between the Russian approach and all this variety of proposals? And why do you think that a ceasefire and a truce are not enough today?
Well, let me just say a couple of words. I understand that I might repeat what has already been said here before me. I know that many of our experts and political analysts have participated or are participating in preparing this event and have already spoken today. But the falsification of history did not just appear today. For many years, our adversaries have been engaged in this with the aim of sowing discord among the peoples of Russia and pursuing their own selfish interests, as well as hindering cooperation in the post-Soviet space. These attempts to drive wedges have become especially active after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and it is precisely this period that is associated with a new surge of nationalist sentiment in Ukraine, which in fact had existed there for a long time but had remained dormant and inactive. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after a short period, the then President Leonid Kuchma wrote a book which was published in 2003. It was called Ukraine is Not Russia. The work is frankly pseudo-scientific, and the author himself said that the goal of this work, and I quote, to create Ukrainians. And in fact, it was precisely this concept which was laid out in the work Ukraine is Not Russia that became a kind of intellectual foundation for the modern nationalist Ukrainian elite. Well, in 2014, when the unconstitutional coup d'etat took place with the support of the United States and with the connivance of the European Union, Ukraine finally turned into a kind of military political bridgehead of the West on our borders. They had been nurturing this dream for quite a long time, and Stalin began to be referred to as anti-Russia. In Odessa, monuments were being torn down. This phenomenon, the phenomenon of demolishing monuments, is, of course, very telling, not only for the current Ukrainian leaders, but also for the Poles and the Baltic states as well. But when the monument to the founder of Odessa, Empress Catherine the Great, was demolished, and a week after that, UNESCO decided that the historic center of Odessa is a World Cultural Heritage Site. Well, it would be impossible to disgrace this once respected organization, now headed by the openly biased Director General Ms. Azoulay, any more than this even if you really tried. Even if you really tried. And I'm not even talking about the other monuments to Alexander Suvorov, Alexander Pushkin, and Isaac Babel. Figures of literature, culture, and the arts whose names are associated with the Russian language. All these monuments are being removed, just like the monuments to those who liberated Ukraine from the Nazi occupiers. And on the contrary, monuments are being erected to those who were collaborators. But it is clear that it is very difficult to replace historical truth. That is why the ideologists of this very concept of Ukraine is not Russia resort to such contrivances and publish supposedly scientific works that make your hair stand on end. This is really, I'm not making jokes. Here, Ukrainians supposedly dug out the Black Sea. Buddha is said to be from Zaporizhia, and the Mona Lisa is of Ukrainian origin. Her great-grandmother and great-grandfather were from Odessa and Kiev. Can you imagine how absurd this is? And it's not just spread by word of mouth. This comes straight from Ukrainian history textbooks. And of course, Russophobia has taken deep root there and is actively supported by Westerners, also within a historical context. Since the mid-19th century, for example, the authorities of the Austro-Hungarian Empire cultivated anti-Russian sentiment in Galicia, in western Ukraine, and began quite actively persecuting the inhabitants of this region, the Rusins. But despite this persecution, a significant part of the Galician Russian intelligentsia and the overwhelming majority of the people remained devoted to their spiritual kinship with our country. Despite all attempts to break these ties during the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian authorities launched large-scale repressions against those same Rusins. Tens of thousands were killed in the death camps of Falarov and Terezi, in the first mass death camps. This was in fact an Austro-Hungarian invention, and now the site of Falarov is occupied by the airport of the Austrian city of Graz. These crimes have not been forgotten by us. Work is underway to have the destruction of the Russian population of Galician Rus and other Russian regions of Austria-Hungary recognized as the first genocide in modern European history. This work will definitely continue. Thank you. In 1929, in Vienna, the infamous Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was established. It became the blueprint for most Ukrainian nationalist parties and organizations in the 1990s and 2000s. That is, alongside the ideological justification under the slogan "Ukraine is not Russia," there was also a material embodiment of this nationalism in essence. NAS is modeled after the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. This organization and those who praised it as the ideal unification of Ukrainians promoted the theory of ethnic purity, AAR. They copied the practices of both Western colonizers, as you know, and German Nazis. Peoples were divided into friendly and supposedly neutral groups. These groups were to be expelled from the territory of Ukraine. And on the other hand, there were unfriendly groups among them, Russians, Poles, Jews, Hungarians, who, according to these Ukrainian nationalists, were to be exterminated. This is exactly what they were engaged in during the years of the Second World War. And now, the experience of those who were the ideologists and who put these misanthropic, hateful principles into practice is being glorified and idolized by the new or revived nationalist movements. Bandera and Shukevich are proclaimed as almost the founders of the modern Ukrainian nation. The Kiev authorities consider themselves the heirs of these criminals, and it is no surprise that for the past 10 or 11 years long, before the start of the special military operation, the Kiev junta began eradicating everything in any way connected to Russia, eradicating everything Russian. Education, first they banned primary school classes in Russian, then secondary education, and eventually even higher education. Culture. Mass media owned by Russian publishers were simply shut down. They were expelled from Ukraine. And those Ukrainian media outlets that broadcast in Russian were also closed. In Ukraine now, currently, there is an unofficial filtering body through which any information must first be carefully reviewed and approved before it can be published or disseminated or broadcast by any mass media outlet in the country. Additionally, the President has long since repeatedly drawn attention to these trends. And about 5 or 6 years ago, he spoke at a meeting of the Victory Organizing Committee, which was preparing for another anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. He touched on these issues and said the following phrase: "Our answer to lies is the truth." And of course, we need to defend the truth. The truth is that the southern Russian lands, and indeed the entire territory of present-day Ukraine, have always been among the most developed and prosperous regions of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Natives of these lands, both before and during Soviet times, consistently held high government positions, including the leader of the Soviet Union, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, who was born in what is now the Dnipropetrovsk region. He worked for a very long time in leadership positions, both in Ukraine itself and then, as you know, in Moscow. And at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic possessed a powerful industrial potential and a developed agricultural sector. But you can judge for yourself what has become of it under the elites who came to power first after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in 2014 unleashed a fratricidal war in Donbass. The statistics are well known, what the economy and social sphere of modern Ukraine are like, what kind of order exists there, including the forcible rounding up of young men on the streets, first shoving them into cars by force, and then sending them to the front. And Russia has absolutely nothing to do with this. Remember, when the coup d'etat took place and the new authorities who came to power in Kiev, as a result of this coup, they were dividing up portfolios and announcing their program. The United States Department of State welcomed these events, and well-known, or rather infamous, Victoria Nuland even proudly admitted that the United States had not spent in vain over the last several years before the coup. They had invested $5 billion in creating, developing, and strengthening Ukrainian democracy. But you see, today there is a lot of talk about national identity, and self-determination. The right of peoples to self-determination is enshrined in the UN Charter. And I have repeatedly and publicly, speaking at the Security Council, at the UN General Assembly, and in my conversations with Antonio Guterres, urged him not to forget that the Charter is not limited to just one line about territorial integrity. Territorial integrity, you know, Guterres' spokesperson, the official representative, Dujarric, I believe. Yes, he repeatedly avoids answering the question, what is the UN's position on the Ukrainian settlement? He repeats by heart, we are in favor of the crisis being resolved on the basis of international law, the principles of territorial integrity of Ukraine, and General Assembly resolutions. As for the General Assembly resolutions, he simply doesn't know that there are many resolutions. And one of the most important for this particular case we're discussing was adopted in 1970. This is a declaration on principles of friendly relations between states based on the UN Charter. It's a substantial document. It was adopted by consensus, unlike those resolutions that the current Kiev regime, with Western support, pushes through by voting, and to which Guterres refers to justify his position as he fully supports the Ukrainian regime. So, in that declaration, which was adopted by consensus, it is written that everyone must respect the territorial integrity of those states whose governments respect the principle of self-determination of peoples, and as a result, represent the entire population living in the relevant territory. But neither Zelensky nor those who came to power in 2014 represent the population of Crimea, Donbass, or Novorossiya. The very first instinctive signal sent by the coup plotters when they came to power in February 2014 through a state coup was the announcement that they would revoke the status of the Russian language in Ukraine. That's it. After that, everything became crystal clear. Those who blindly and stubbornly repeat the slogan about territorial integrity forget a very simple thing. It was precisely the principle of self-determination of peoples that formed the basis of the decolonization process. According to the 1970 declaration, for example, African peoples simply did not want to live under colonial rule, and the colonizers in Lisbon, in Paris, in London, in all the capitals of the metropolitan countries, those governments did not represent the African peoples. And if that's the case, then the decolonization process was carried out fully in accordance with both the UN Charter and the principles developed by the General Assembly regarding the interrelation of the Charter's principles. In the same way, as I've already said, the current Ukrainian authorities in no way represent the peoples of Crimea, Novorossiya, and Donbass. Moreover, we have distributed, if anyone doesn't have these documents, we have distributed them more than once. These are documents that quote statements made by Ukrainian authorities regarding Russian and Russian-speaking citizens of their country, at least, for a period long before the special military operation. Zelensky stated, "If you feel connected to Russian culture, but live in Ukraine, my advice for the sake of your children's and grandchildren's peace of mind is to get out to Russia." And all the other figures from his cabinet spoke even more openly, including calls to kill Russians. And the infamously notorious Ukrainian ambassador to Kazakhstan, who has since been recalled in 2022, I believe, gave an interview live on air, and when asked what tasks the Ukrainian authorities faced, he said, "To kill as many Russians as possible because we want there to be none of them at all. That's why we need to kill as many as possible, so that our children have less work left to do." The ambassador, and there was not a single reproach from any Western power that supports this regime. That's it. And there are plenty of examples from modern Ukrainian history. These are things that just get swept under the rug. And no one intends to investigate these crimes. Dessa, May 2, 2014. 50 living people were burned alive in the trade union's house simply because they spoke out against what the putschists, who had illegally seized power, were doing. The Council of Europe, which is now actively preparing claims against the Russian Federation, in connection with the current events they call aggression, occupation, and annexation. At that time, the Council of Europe timidly offered its services to assist in investigating the brutal crime in which 50 people were burned alive. It even adopted some kind of resolution stating that it was ready to assist, and now no one remembers this anymore because the Kiev authorities ignored the Council of Europe, showed its place as they saw it, and since then the Council of Europe has also been tasked with whitewashing the Kiev criminals and discrediting the actions of the Russian Federation. Although in fact there's really nothing to investigate there. The people who set the fire and then started shooting at those who tried to save themselves by jumping out of windows, they're all on video in the footage. There's really no work to be done there at all. Just publish this data and that's it. Another episode of lies and cover-ups is, of course, Bucha, April 2022, when the Russian armed forces, at the request of the West and in anticipation of signing a peace agreement based on the principles proposed by the Ukrainians themselves, the West asked our leadership, as a gesture of goodwill, to withdraw troops from Kiev, which was done, including pulling out from the Kiev suburb called Bucha. And 2 days after the mayor returned there, not somewhere in a basement, but right on the main street of this settlement, BBC correspondents who just happened to be conveniently nearby showed dozens of bodies of people neatly laid out along both sides of this main street. There was an outburst of anger. The West once again used this BBC report as a pretext to impose a new round of sanctions against the Russian Federation. And since then, we've been asking, has anyone investigated this crime? We wrote a letter to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. He has remained silent for many months now, perhaps even more than a year. According to our information, they know everything perfectly well, but are afraid to speak the truth, which is at least partially known to them. And the most telling example of hypocrisy and covering up for criminals is the refusal to provide the names of those people whose bodies were shown and which caused such an outburst of indignation. There's no information at all. If someone, after all this, says that Ukrainians are suffering and that somehow Russia must be forced, that we cannot leave people under the rule of the current regime there, and if the government, the so-called junta, essentially Zelensky's regime, if they are counting on somehow reaching an agreement to end the hostilities, and that whatever is left of Ukraine will continue to live under the laws they have enacted. That is an illusion. This must not be allowed under any circumstances. On the territory of Ukraine, which lies outside the constitutional borders of the Russian Federation, millions of people speak Russian. It is their native language. And to leave them under the rule of the junta, which has even banned speaking Russian, just think about what they have prohibited would be a truly grave crime. I hope, and I'm confident, that we, for our part, will certainly not allow this to happen. I also hope that the international community will not allow such mockery of the UN Charter, where in the very first article it is written, everyone is obliged to respect human rights regardless of race, gender, language, and religion. Both the Russian language and the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church are banned in Ukraine. So at this stage of efforts to resolve the situation, the simplest and absolutely foolproof thing for our Western colleagues who are fussing about would be to demand the repeal of laws that directly violate the Charter of the United Nations, not to mention the numerous conventions on the rights of national minorities. That would be a real test of what the Europeans' position actually is. Well, not all, but the majority of Europeans led by London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and Warsaw, who have not once uttered the words human rights in relation to what is happening in Ukraine. But when they discuss the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, the Islamic Republic, the Republic of Iran, Venezuela, almost any country, really, when they discuss and build any kind of relationship with them, there are always lectures about the need to respect human rights. But there is no other country we were just recalling with the Israeli ambassador that Arabic is not banned in Israel, nor is Hebrew banned in Arab countries. There is nothing like this anywhere else. But in Ukraine, everything is allowed. Moreover, not only do they turn a blind eye, but Ursula von der Leyen, Mr. Michel before his resignation, and all the officials in Brussels proudly say, defending their position on Ukraine and persuading their voters that they need to tighten their belts and wait for better times, because right now they have to help Ukraine. Never mind healthcare, never mind heating. And they say we need to wait, because Ukraine is defending European values. So draw your own conclusions about what Europe considers its values. True Nazism is being revived, and there are plenty of examples of this, including the speech by the new German Chancellor, Mr. Merz, who said that the time has come for Germany to once again lead Europe. To say such things, well, you really have to be quite a cynic. The militarization of Europe has been declared as one of the main objectives for the second half of the decade. This is a very dangerous trend. I won't go on, though I could talk about this for a long time. It's something that concerns me. But let's move on to the question.
But I would like to say, it seems to me that you have been bringing up the historical agenda a lot lately, events. So, in particular, that's the first question I wanted to ask. But since I have the opportunity,
I handed over the microphone.
I know every day we read about a multitude of proposals that come in, well, pseudo-proposals from our opponents and proposals from our friends, including India, China, Brazil, and discussions about how to reach some kind of solution or settlement to the Ukrainian crisis. So I would like to ask about your position. What is the fundamental difference between these proposals and our current stance? You have already partially answered this question by characterizing the Kiev regime and its current state. It is very difficult to negotiate with them, if it's even possible at all. But nevertheless,
why is it difficult?
The negotiations began.
We reached agreements in April or in February, at the end of February, when the Ukrainians in 2022, after the start of the special military operation, when the Ukrainians requested negotiations, we immediately agreed. There were several rounds in Belarus, and then we moved to Istanbul. That was already the end of March. beginning of April. And it was the Ukrainians, President Putin has spoken about this many times, he even showed the documents. It was Ukrainians who proposed to resolve the situation based on principles they themselves had written. Renouncing joining NATO and any other military alliances and refusing to host military bases on their territory. But in fact, it was the British who had been planning to establish bases both in Ochakiv and on the Sea of Azov. All of this is documented. They had been eyeing Crimea for a long time, even before 2014, and therefore no military bases, no military exercises on the territory of Ukraine, and security guarantees, which they themselves asked to be provided by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Germany and Turkey. And the list of those wishing to join, so to speak, was open. Anyone who wanted to join in, well, the guarantees were formulated almost in the same terms as Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the Washington Treaty. And it was emphasized that these guarantees would not apply to Crimea or to the territory of Donbass. They worked on these principles, and that the dialogue would continue on other aspects of the settlement. And we agreed. This was, well, important in order to ensure the main goal at that time, which was to prevent NATO from entering Ukrainian territory. And there were other guarantees provided as well, including for national minorities. And all of this was destroyed. The President has returned to this topic more than once, but in the years since up to the present day, we have always emphasized at the highest level and at other levels that we are ready for negotiations, for peace talks that will be dedicated to understanding and addressing the root causes of this crisis. It wasn't us who avoided contact. They claimed that Zelensky said he would never even sit next to us. He signed a decree prohibiting negotiations with Putin and therefore with his government. Now they're trying to spin it, saying that's not really the case, that it's just about not being able to meet with Putin personally. But if you can't meet with Putin, then why were you shouting, I went to Istanbul, but Putin doesn't want to come there? If you just compare all the arguments coming out of Ukraine, it's obvious that this is an inadequate, unfit leader, and it's very hard to understand when and what he will do when you fly to South Africa, when you go to Europe to hug someone. But the President very clearly stated our assessment of the legitimacy, the degree of legitimacy of Zelensky and his regime. At the same time, he emphasized that we are still not refusing to engage in contact with him and his administration in order to agree on principles of settlement that are acceptable to everyone. It's another matter when it comes to signing. That's when the question of legitimacy will be of decisive importance. Because if the agreement is signed by those whose legitimacy, to put it mildly, no longer convinces anyone, then their successors may call the agreement into question. But just look at how the position has changed, both among ordinary Ukrainians, the Ukrainian leadership, and the West. Until recently, well, even just a year ago, they were declaring no negotiations, no ceasefire, only Russia's strategic defeat will save the situation on the battlefield. And Russia must withdraw to the borders of 1991. And then, when they began to realize that the situation on the front lines was changing far from in favor of the Kiev regime. They started to strike a new note, still opposing a halt to hostilities and the start of negotiations, because as they all stated, in order to begin negotiations, Ukraine must secure a position of strength and talk to Russia from a position of strength. Are we talking about history here? What is it teaching any of these people? And let them remember how their ancestors, their forebears, tried to talk to Russia from a position of strength, but it's useless. And now it is they who are asking for a pause, only so they can once again flood it with weapons. They said so publicly. My former colleague, now the president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, for example, says Putin must immediately agree to a ceasefire, but the ceasefire will not impose any restrictions on the West's relations with the Ukrainian regime. What does that mean? It means they want to continue militarizing the state. Here we have members of the delegation who recently went to Istanbul for the first round of negotiations, and the Ukrainians, you see, sat there, talked, discussed the agreements that were starting to take shape about the exchange of prisoners of war, and about both sides having prepared and planning to prepare a memorandum outlining the issues that should form the basis of the settlement, the ones that need to be given priority attention. They reached agreements, and nothing particularly special happened. They reached agreements because they expected that Western support, including from the United States, would last forever, and that they would always be allowed to do whatever they wanted. But President Trump showed a different understanding of the situation. He repeatedly emphasizes that this is not his war, this is Biden's war. And that's exactly right. His position that the US consistently acts in accordance with its national interests also applies to the situation in Ukraine. So, what national interest does the United States have in Ukraine? Apart from that very goal, which democratic administrations have been pushing, namely to contain, encircle, and constantly keep Russia under pressure, yes, none other than that. Economically, by all means, go ahead. No one is forbidding anyone from doing that. That's it. So, yes, we support negotiations. Yes, there will be a second round of talks. They have confirmed this. And that is already a positive development.
Work on the memorandum is underway today, right?
It is underway, yes, it is. I don't know about their side, but our work is already at an advanced stage, and in any case, we will hand over this memorandum to the Ukrainians as agreed, and we will expect them to do the same.
Is there any clarity on the timing of the next meetings? Because there's a lot of talk about this right now.
No, the dates have not been set yet. A lot of people are speculating about when and where it will take place. No, at this time, we really don't have any ideas or suggestions to offer. Honestly, I want to be completely transparent with you about that. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that we do have a papal nuncio present here with us, correct? No? I thought
he was here during registration. He indicated.
Nevertheless, I just want to say, so that people don't waste their mental energy working through options that aren't very realistic. Because, well, just imagine the Vatican as the venue for negotiations. It's a bit inelegant, I would say, perhaps even somewhat awkward in my opinion, when Orthodox countries are going to sit down and seriously discuss issues that are directly concerning, well, the elimination of root causes, especially when doing so on a Catholic platform, it raises questions. One of the most significant root causes, as we know, is the ongoing campaign to destroy the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Instead, when Poroshenko was president of Ukraine, he formally asked the ecumenical patriarch in Istanbul for a tomos in order to create an alternative church, which later became widely known primarily for its thugs and violent supporters, forcibly seizing the canonical churches, temples, sometimes even killing priests or severely beating them, as well as committing other acts of violence. There is also the Greek Catholic Uniate Church in Ukraine, which is also very, very active, and these are Catholics very actively working in support of the regime that was established in Ukraine after the coup. I think that under these circumstances, it would not be very comfortable for the Vatican itself to receive delegations from two Orthodox countries.
Alexander Sergeyevich, if we think about the future, this year we will be marking the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Agreement. And it's clear that a very important decision was made in Helsinki, one that ensured peace and stability in Europe for quite a long time. But then events occurred that in general seriously undermined this agreement. I mean, the events in the Balkans, in Transnistria, in the South Caucasus, and so on. And our leadership, President Putin, at various stages has repeatedly spoken about the need to create a new architecture of European security, and one that would correspond to today's realities and for a sufficiently long period, at least for the lifetime of one generation, but ideally for several generations, would ensure peace and stability in Europe. In your opinion, is it even possible today to talk about efforts in this direction, and is Europe ready to address these issues? Or does the current situation allow us to push this prospect far into the future?
Well, Europe is experiencing a deep security crisis. And as I already mentioned, Europe is thinking about militarization. And I want to emphasize once again that it is very alarming that Germany is taking the lead in these discussions. Well, to be specific, Chancellor Merkel spoke 2 weeks ago, or rather a week and a half ago, in the Bundestag, and I quote, "Strengthening the Bundeswehr is our top priority. In the future, the German government will provide all the financial resources necessary for the Bundeswehr to become the strongest conventional army in Europe." Doesn't that remind you of anything? At one time, Hitler had the strongest conventional army in Europe. And there's another very interesting point. From Merz's statements, he recently said that Russia will not stop in Ukraine, justifying his course toward militarization and creating the strongest army. He said that Russia will not stop in Ukraine and will go on to seize Europe. According to Freud, that's what he would do, because he doesn't need to protect his compatriots or tribesmen, but to seize land and start exploiting it. There you have it. In other words, these are Nazi instincts. They've turned out to be surprisingly resilient. That's it. So, as for our position, well, it is based on the obvious fact that Euro-Atlantic security models have not proven themselves. This applies first and foremost to the OSCE. But we are also witnessing a deep crisis in NATO as the main North Atlantic structure of the West, so to speak. The European Union, having signed an agreement with NATO about 1.5 or 2 years ago, has practically become an appendage in the military political sense, since this agreement gives NATO the right to use the territories of all non-NATO member states whenever it needs to move weapons and equipment eastward, that is, closer to us. Right? And I believe I've already mentioned this. Eurasia is the largest continent, the richest, the most populous continent. It is the homeland of many great civilizations, right? And it's a continent with many integration structures, but there is no continent-wide umbrella structure, and there never has been. Africa also has many integration associations, and Latin America has many as well. But there is the African Union there, and there is CIALAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. But in Eurasia, there is no such all-encompassing organization, or even an association or movement and organization is not even necessary, but nothing like that exists, which is probably unnatural. And looking at real life, we see prospects, including in terms of increasing the competitiveness of the countries of the Eurasian continent. We see prospects in establishing working relationships between the existing integration associations. The Eurasian Economic Union has relations with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and with ASEAN. ASEAN has relations with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. And there is an initiative from Kazakhstan, which we support a conference on interaction and confidence building measures in Asia, which is currently underway, with ongoing discussions about transforming it into an organization. There is the Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Gulf. This is also a very promising association, and considering the process of normalizing relations between the Arab monarchies and Iran, this significantly increases the economic, transit, and logistical potential. There is the Central Asian Five, with which many countries on the continent, and even beyond, are establishing ties. And all of this, if each of these associations has its own plans for developing transport routes and energy supply routes, then of course it is much more advantageous and efficient to harmonize these plans rather than having everyone do the same things separately in their own areas. And the president formulated his vision for establishing connections among all these existing structures quite some time ago at the first Russia-ASEAN summit, basing it on real-life needs, and suggested that the result of this process would be the formation of a greater Eurasian partnership. And the process is underway. The same goes for international transport corridors, like the North-South corridor, which makes it possible to establish a direct connection between, say, the Baltic Sea and the Indian Ocean. And there are other ideas as well. For example, I was in Armenia yesterday. The Armenian side is working on the Crossroads of Pieces initiative, aiming to integrate its territory and logistical capabilities into these large continent-wide processes. And speaking of this, we support the development of all infrastructure projects so that, as our Chinese friends say, thousands and millions of flowers may bloom. But in order to actually implement the Crossroads of Pieces, for example, a peace treaty needs to be signed between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We sincerely wish them success in this. Just yesterday, we discussed this with both the Prime Minister and the President of Armenia. It is clear that the agreement became possible thanks to several trilateral summits between Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And we are ready to continue providing assistance if both sides are interested in this. And of course, normalization between Armenia and the Republic of Turkey is also necessary. Overcoming conflicts and lifting the restrictions on transport and economic ties that were imposed as a result of these conflicts will, of course, significantly increase the competitiveness of both this part of the continent and our entire continent. Well, and the greater Eurasian partnership, as we see it, based on real life, would become a solid material foundation for efforts and work on forming a Eurasian security architecture. I proceed from the belief that this should be handled by the countries of the continent and that the structure should be built specifically within the logic of Eurasian security, not Euro-Atlantic. It's not because we want to isolate ourselves in some way or for any particular reason, but there is NATO, and there are countries that are genuinely interested in being organizationally intertwined with North America. They have that opportunity by all means. But this should not become an obstacle for other countries, or rather, it should not be used to create obstacles to the establishment of a structure that all Eurasian countries can and should have the right to join, including the western part of our continent. I don't see any reason here to suspect some kind of conspiracy in this, but there are attempts to pursue unilateral initiatives from the other side, specifically from NATO. Do you remember there was the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg? Many people have already forgotten about him, but he led the North Atlantic Alliance's secretariat for a long time, and in his last year in that position, when NATO was already actively promoting Indo-Pacific strategies, journalists asked Stoltenberg, so you are moving into the Indo-Pacific region. It seems that NATO has always said it is a defensive alliance and that its mission is to protect the territories of its member countries from external threats. He didn't even blink, didn't blush, and said, yes, that's right. But now the threat to the territories of NATO member countries comes from Southeast Asia, from Northeast Asia, from the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. That's exactly what he said. And the fact that NATO is now moving its infrastructure to the eastern part of the Eurasian continent, that NATO is actively trying, well, basically, to weaken at the very least, and that's putting it mildly to weaken ASEAN's unity, trying to lure individual ASEAN members into closed bloc structures, sometimes trilateral, sometimes quadrilateral, and declaring that this region is of vital importance to NATO. Why is the Euro-Atlantic structure devising plans to subordinate, to extend its influence practically over the entire Eurasian continent all the way to the Far East? If the Eurasian countries themselves do not address the issues of security architecture, then all that's left is to watch as these matters are handled from across the ocean. Another aspect of this problem, of course, is that President Trump, as I have already mentioned, insists that his foreign policy is based on national interests. He believes that European problems should, at the very least, be dealt with more by the Europeans themselves rather than by the United States. This is also a trend toward ensuring that Eurasian interests are in some ways still represented in discussions about how to provide security. This, as I have already mentioned, is contradicted by the completely aggressive, revanchist rhetoric coming from Brussels and Berlin regarding the militarization of Europe and the conditioning of their populations to prepare for war with Russia. We need to counter these with peaceful efforts. And here, from the very beginning, we actively supported the initiative of Belarus, which a couple of years ago held the first conference on Eurasian security issues in Minsk. And last year, the second conference took place. The third one is scheduled for this fall. We are just after the second conference, and I participated in both, and I will definitely participate in the upcoming one. After the second conference, my colleague, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus, Ryzankov, and I circulated our vision for a draft document, which we have tentatively called the Eurasian Charter of Multipolarity and Diversity. By the way, some ministers from EU countries, other European countries, and Serbia in particular also took part, because we emphasize that Eurasian discussions about Eurasian security should be led by, it should be open to all countries of the Eurasian continent. But for now, all of this is still in progress. We, as I already said at the very beginning of this question, we are not trying to artificially or schematically draw something and then say, this is what distinguishes us, our approach from the authors and promoters of Indo-Pacific strategies, which in fact were originally conceived in NATO offices and then began to be actively advanced first in NATO itself. And then they were subsequently supported elsewhere. We are trying to grasp the practical trends in real life. And as I have already said, these trends primarily consist in the fact that the numerous structures created on the Eurasian continent are interested in building bridges, and many bridges have already been built, and in using these bridges to implement mutually beneficial practical projects. But it is absolutely clear that the priorities lie within the Eurasian framework, including those related to security issues. I must say that today experts have begun to actively engage with these issues. At the upcoming Primakov readings in June, a separate session will be devoted to this Eurasian framework, to Eurasian security. But you just mentioned the United States and mentioned Trump. And in this regard, here's a question. If we talk about the Russian-American track of relations and abstract a bit from the Ukrainian issue scenes, after all, it is not the only one on the agenda of Russian-American relations. How do things stand apart from the issues related to the Ukrainian crisis? A return to normalcy. At that time, Yuri Ushakov and I, at the suggestion of the Americans, met in Riyadh with Marco Rubio and then National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, and both sides clearly established a mutual understanding that the foundation of the foreign policy of normal countries should be based on national interests. This is President Trump's position, and this is President Putin's position. Not some ideological considerations of spreading one's influence as widely as possible. If we take national interests as the foundation, then I hope Marco Rubio won't take offense. He simply stated that, Ifan, we respect the fact that every country has its own national interests, especially when it comes to great powers. From this, two conclusions follow. First, the national interests of any two countries, and especially of two major great powers, will never fully coincide. Moreover, in most cases, they will not coincide. And yet, when they do coincide, it would be a colossal mistake not to take advantage of this alignment of national interests to steer the situation toward joint, mutually beneficial projects, whether in the economic, technological, or other spheres. And the second conclusion, when these interests do not coincide but instead clash, it is the duty and responsibility of the respective powers to ensure that this clash does not escalate into confrontation, especially not into a heated confrontation.
This was, so to speak, the conceptual overture to our discussions in Riyadh. And I feel when I observe what is happening in real life, that at this stage, the Trump administration is indeed acting in this way. And this is how we have always acted. We have never tried to teach anyone how to live, never lectured anyone. This is a significant change in Washington's policy compared to the Democratic administration. Although we see that this White House policy is causing serious unrest among the elites, including the Republican elites, many there are not used to living this way, to not being involved in everything and not deciding everything for everyone. But we, of course, are sober-minded people in the political sense. And here it is very important not to give in to illusions. It is important to be realists. We need to understand that there have been many situations when the United States radically changed its position. That's life. There's no getting away from that. But of course, this must be taken into account. And we certainly do take it into account when planning our actions. But all of the things being equal, we are ready to implement mutually beneficial projects. Specifically, mutually beneficial ones. This includes space, high technology, and of course, energy. American companies have operated here. And all of this is possible if, I repeat, our American partners are willing to coordinate, and I believe they are willing to agree on such principles that will ensure equality and mutual benefit. Alexei Viktorovich, returning to the Ukrainian crisis, in your opinion, has it influenced and is it influencing the formation of a new world order? And what irreversible changes have taken place, and how favorable or unfavorable are these changes for our homeland, for Russia?
Well, I believe that the trend is a healthy one. It is the trend toward the formation of a multipolar world. Many consider this a pipe dream because they say even the major powers, first of all here among the countries of the global majority, even the major powers, still no one wants to quarrel with the United States. We, in general, don't want to quarrel with anyone. But we want to work honestly. And I want to emphasize once again what I've said, I believe even here in this very audience. When we gather to discuss Ukraine, we do not see any need to break the international legal foundation of the world order as embodied in the Charter of the United Nations. But it simply needs to be respected in its entirety, in the totality and interconnection of the principles contained within it. This is already a textbook example. When it was necessary to break up the remnants of Yugoslavia, the West unilaterally declared Kosovo's independence and said that this was the right of nations to self-determination, even though by that time no one had used force there for a very long time. And UN Security Council Resolution 1244 was in effect, which affirmed Kosovo's belonging to, Serbia. At that time, it was still the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. When 2008, it was, when 6 years later, not in a calm and peaceful environment, but after a bloody coup d'etat in Ukraine, the junta that came to power directly began military actions against its own people, because in Crimea they refused to recognize the results of the coup. And the same refusal happened in Donbass. So they sent combat aircraft against them when Luhansk was bombed from the air. The center of Luhansk, no one remembers this now. People were burned alive. And when the people of Crimea, foreseeing well, not even foreseeing, but faced with so-called friendship trains full of armed bandits sent to seize the Crimean parliament, when they rose up against this and held a referendum, the West said, no, this is impossible because it violates territorial integrity. But what about Serbia? But that's different. And After that, the Serbs appealed to the International Court of Justice, which, after careful consideration, ruled that declaring independence by a part of a state does not necessarily require the explicit consent of the central authorities according to their interpretation. Well, it all seems clear, case closed. But to this day, it seems no one wants to acknowledge this. And when Europe, despite everything that has long been known, despite the fact that even the United States, under the Trump administration, is taking a more realistic and pragmatic look at the situation in Ukraine, Trump was the first, if not the only leader so far, who publicly and openly said that there was a gross mistake to draw Ukraine into NATO. And that will never happen. And the Biden administration is to blame for this. And Europe, despite all this, yes, now even representatives of the current American administration are publicly saying that the territorial issue is inevitable. It will have to be resolved based on realities and so on. But Europe stubbornly and rather foolishly keeps repeating that the Russians must withdraw to the 1,991 borders. As I've already said, when this conflict ends on, I hope that's how it will be, what will happen to the territories that remain outside the constitutional borders of the Russian Federation. What kind of order will exist there? Will the Zelensky regime remain there and continue to oppress, excuse my blunt language, everything Russian, in violation of all norms of international law? And when Europe calls for a return to the 1,991 borders, does it really want to hand over the people of Crimea, Novorossiya, and Donbass to this regime? They're not demanding that Ukrainian laws be changed there. They claim that these laws protect European values. So I really don't think that this is a simple task. The memorandum that we agreed to prepare and hand over to the Ukrainians, we are already practically drafting. It will be based on the most fundamental principles and on the understanding of the root causes underlying this conflict and how these root causes must be removed like a cancerous tumor.
And how are we doing on time? Does our audience have the opportunity? The opportunity for participants to ask questions.
A couple of questions, go ahead.
Colleagues, you have the opportunity to ask a couple of questions. Is there anyone who would like to do so?
Dear Sergei Viktorovich, I'm not a diplomat. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of CIS countries. First of all, I wanted to thank you for your stance that we will not back away from addressing the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, and for the fact that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is considering the issue of recognizing the genocide of the Galician Russian Triodion. I have written a collection on special military operation theology, examined in detail, and I offer the ministry this document. The message of Saint Patriarch Tikhon, saying the Russian Church cannot accept peace if Kiev and other Russian lands are separated from Russia. I give it to you for the ministry's work. Here you go. And actually, I don't have any specific questions. I just want to express words of support and say that I fully support your position.
Thank you.
Colleagues, are there any questions? Then, Sergei Viktorovich, I would like to ask a question, perhaps even a somewhat personal one. As the minister and for the ministry as a whole, what lessons have you and the ministry learned from the Ukrainian crisis, its course and its current state? I know that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is giving these questions very serious thought. I think the audience will find this interesting.
What conclusions?
Yes. What have you and the ministry concluded?
With every single day of work, especially in recent years regarding the Ukrainian issue, I am more and more convinced that our cause is just.
A good and concise answer.